Thank you for being with me today. I'm here with Madison Margolin. She's the co-founder of DoubleBlind magazine. She's quarantined in Los Angeles, getting through this like the rest of us, and we're really excited to talk to you today. Thank you. Thanks for being here, Madison.
For having me.
Let's jump in. You're the co-founder of DoubleBlind. It's such a beautiful magazine. You guys have such an elevated aesthetic, and the production, it's really, really special. It's really high production quality, and I think you have a unique voice in the industry. Can you tell us, let's start with how you got into the psychedelic space.
Yeah, so I've always been really curious about psychedelics. I have been, ever since I was 18, essentially, I was kind of obsessed with them. I did this whole research project when I was a freshman at UC Berkeley, and kind of dove straight into like the Berkeley PC and what was left of it when I was still in college, and did a whole research paper on psychedelics before I'd ever even tried them. And then having done all of this research and reading about the experiences, it's as if you read the guidebook to Paris or something, and then you finally go on that trip. And I did, and it was just, I did mushrooms, and it was just sort of life-changing. And I kind of grew up in a sort of a psychedelic culture, I guess you could say, in that my dad actually defended Timothy Leary on a cannabis bust back in the day. And
wow, that gives you serious street cred. Serious street cred.
I didn't really know Leary myself. I was a baby when he passed away. I think there are a few baby pictures of me with him once, but well, anyways, so I grew up sort of, my parents are kind of hippies. They're also friends with the Ram Dass scene. Ram Dass being, for those of you who are listening and don't know, Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary were professors at Harvard together, studying psychedelics, and their research went too far, and they both got kicked out. Ram Dass, or Richard Alpert, went to India and met with a guru and became Ram Dass and went on his own spiritual journey, which was really, by and large, I would say, affected by his psychedelic experience. And so his whole spiritual outlook had a lot to do with psychedelics, and that's kind of the spirituality, a mix of like this Hindu Jewish spirituality that I was raised with. So this forward, when I went to journalism school, I focused on cannabis mainly after I graduated, and had always had cannabis, I'd say, as a gateway plant into sort of the psychedelic world. Cannabis is itself a little bit of a psychedelic. And I always just had them on my radar and would take stories on psychedelics when I had the opportunity to. With regard to DoubleBlind, the idea was my co-founder, Shelby's. She was meditating, and the concept of a psychedelic magazine just sort of popped into her head while she was meditating. And she and I, who knew each other through journalism school and through working together, after that, she called me up and she says, "Hey, do you want to do this magazine with me?" And I was like, "Sure, sounds fun." And little did we know we would be co-founding a whole startup.
Dass recently passed away also,
yeah,
right?
He did. Yeah. He left his body, as they say.
His body, right. He was pretty awesome, an amazing life, to look at the trajectory of his life.
Yeah, I mean, it's very relatable coming from a Jewish background and sort of seeing how Ram Dass, at the heart of it, he is a nice Jewish boy who went to India like the rest of them. So, it's very, very close to my heart.
So you kind of evolve into the co-founder of DoubleBlind. It's more than a magazine. It's so much more than a magazine, right? So walk me through like a typical day. How does a psychedelic magazine co-founder, what are you busy with all day?
So I am focused on editorial, and my co-founder is focused more on like the business development side of things. So, my everyday is corresponding with writers, editing, coming up with my own story ideas, working on my own stories, We just closed issue 3, which is going to go to print really soon and coming out early this summer. So, you know, also interfacing with artists, or rather our designer and our photo editor who have been interfacing with the artists, but sort of making those broad decisions about what the aesthetic is going to look like in print. Just to sort of lay it out, we're digital and print, so we come out twice a year, the magazine itself, and then every day now we're publishing a story on the website. We also just launched a course on how to grow your own mushrooms. So
I saw that.
Yeah, so that was open for a while. We just closed that actually, but we're going to be coming out with more online courses. We've been doing webinars, Instagram lives. We had a few events in our you know, on the calendar that have been canceled, one of which was a psychedelic Seder, but to be postponed. Yeah.
Okay, I'm coming next year.
Yeah, and that was actually going to be on 4/19, which is Bicycle Day, which is sort of like the 420 of LSD when the day that Albert Hoffman intentionally took acid for the first time. So,
I don't think it's a coincidence that it's 4/19 and 4/20. I don't know. I just never. How is that? It could be any day of the year.
There's something very synchronous about the fact that they're right next to each other, those 2 days. So yeah, they're, you know, the best way to sort of keep up with DoubleBlind is through our social media. And again, we have all of these things that we're doing, just having to make a few adjustments since quarantine.
Okay, cool. Tell me, when you look at the industry, what frustrates you about the industry?
So I wrote a story a few months ago for Playboy, actually, and I think the editor titled it like "The Rocky Road to Legal Psychedelics." And, you know, our main character was David Bronner of Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps, and their ethos is all one, right? All one or none, I think is how it goes. And what's frustrating is that there are so many passionate people in the psychedelic space, and sometimes that all one ethos gets a little bit obscured. And it's, you know, I think it's important to say, like, this notion of oneness is definitely a psychedelic principle or value. It's actually, scientists have identified the criteria for a quote unquote mystical experience when you're under the influence of psychedelics, and oneness is one of those criteria. And so what's frustrating is that it looks like there are all these different approaches and branches to bringing about a post-prohibition world. So you have FDA approved research, you have grassroots campaigns to decriminalize. You have a number of companies now that are creating synthetic versions of psychedelics. And I think what's important to keep in sight is that, you know, the frustration is that it looks like it's so fractured and people disagree all the time, and there can be drama and controversy. And I think if we sort of, and Bronner, the reason I had made him this main character is because he does a lot to fund all of these movements that seem like they might not necessarily be particularly aligned. And it shows that it's kind of part of one singular movement, which is to make psychedelics more available. And
he was actually our first interview. We interviewed him about 10 days ago. What do you see as the biggest opportunity in psychedelics right now?
I mean, I really do think that people are the conversation around mental health has never been so relevant, I would say. And I think the opportunity is that psychedelics are forcing people to have honest conversations about trauma and about depression and anxiety and addiction. And the conversations are centered around solutions, which are, you know, psychedelics. I think they're really destigmatizing topics that have been difficult to broach before, especially because the quote unquote pharmaceutical solutions that we've already haven't really been working. And so it's, you know, especially for some people, it can be embarrassing to be on antidepressants your entire life or something, and it's not working, and how do you talk about it? and so forth. So that is the opportunity, is that the paradigm shift is really, really forcing people to focus on what does it mean to be well.
I wonder if part of the stigma of mental illness, it just occurred to me when you were saying this, part of the stigma is because it's quote unquote incurable.
I mean, I think it's also, I think, and MAPS has done a lot, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies has done a lot to really open up the conversation around trauma. And even just people recognizing trauma in themselves or in their genetics or inherited or whatnot. And that is just so relevant. And I think, even in the Jewish world, people are starting to really acknowledge that we have all of this untreated, like, inherited trauma. And it's just been so powerful to, even for me personally, to recognize that this exists in my family. And
Have you heard of this word called epigenetics?
Yes.
That's what you're referring to? Is that what you're referring to?
There's a few, I am referring to epigenetics, which I guess for also those of you who are listening and don't know, it's how trauma can, or how your genetics, how your genes act differently based on the experiences of your ancestors.
And how your DNA is affected by the experiences of your ancestors, and how that could even, where I go with it is how you can map it out. Like my father, Lev Shalom, was a Holocaust survivor. So I would love to understand. There is a lot of understanding already, but I just think it's really fascinating from that perspective.
Yeah.
And then it's particularly Jewish, not that we are the only people who have trauma, but for me also, what's very compelling is when they talk about, without getting political at all, but when you talk about like helping soldiers with PTSD.
I do think there are political implications. For example, MAPS is doing research. They're doing a study right now. Natalie Ginsburg, who's their policy and advocacy director, and also a researcher from Imperial College London and a Palestinian peace activist, are looking at Israelis and Palestinians who are in ayahuasca circles together and seeing how that can promote conflict resolution. And
oh my gosh, wow.
Yeah, so that's, again, it's a self-selecting group of people who want to sit in mixed circles, but even that, they're sort of dealing with trauma that's coming up, different anecdotal reports. A woman was triggered by Arabic, just the kind of hearing someone speak Arabic, and was sitting next to a Palestinian woman in ceremony, and the woman started praying in Arabic, and the Jewish woman had to sort of really like empathize with her in that moment. And I think that's such a powerful thing, and could have, again, huge policy and social ramifications if people really could acknowledge their trauma and get past it, and then stop voting out of or making decisions out of these existential threats that they're feeling. I wrote a story about the role of trauma in the conflict, so I'm very passionate about it.
Oh yeah, I want to talk to you about it because I've also done like Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian interfaith work in LA and here a little bit, but that's really something that I find deeply compelling. I feel like if you could deal with the trauma, then you make way for solutions and creativity.
Exactly.
So it seems really optimistic from my perspective. What would you say has been your biggest surprise since you got into the industry?
I don't know if this is a surprise per se, but one thing that I think is really an interesting notion is that a lot of companies are trying to synthesize pharmaceutical style psychedelics minus the trip. And it's a little bit controversial in the psychedelic space because some people would say that the journey is the medicine, right? Like the experience of getting through a trip is the thing that is healing you more so or as much as the chemical play that's going on in your brain. So I would say it's almost surprising that it's become a conversation whether tripping is something that you can dispense with. And again, psychedelics aren't for everyone. And so I recognize that different pharmaceutical companies would want to make them more accessible and more digestible to people who don't necessarily want to have the experience of a full psychedelic trip. But I did, when this conversation first became more, when it first became a bigger conversation, at least in the discourse, that was a little surprising to me.
Cool. I never really even thought about it. Is that kind of like the CBD without the THC?
A little bit, yeah. It's sort of, you could make that comparison. Like, for example, there's one company that is focusing on a compound found in magic mushrooms called oruganacin, which is sort of like the CBD of magic mushrooms, in that if you are able to like manipulate the chemistry of what you're dealing with and up the oruganacin, you might not have a bad trip, or it might make you less anxious, or it's very similar to the way people now are sort of playing with cannabis chemistry and trying to enhance certain aspects and tone down other aspects.
What would you, looking ahead to the near future, let's say for psychedelic medicine, if you had one prediction for the next 12 months, what would you say? What would it be?
Next 12 months, okay. Well, we have a few measures that people are going to be voting on in November. So my prediction is I think at least one of them will pass. I think there's a lot of momentum currently. You know, last year we saw Denver decriminalized psilocybin, and then, you know, like a month later, Oakland decriminalized all entheogenic plants. And then, you know, then 6 months, you know, in January, Santa Cruz did it. And now more than 100 cities in the US are sort of trying to get their own initiatives and legislation together.
Know that. I didn't know it was that many.
So it's all very, very small and grassroots. So the group is Decriminalize Nature. So that's the group that started in Oakland, and the concept is to decriminalize psychedelic plants. Just not only psilocybin, but like ayahuasca, peyote, whatever. What's interesting about Decrim Nature is that it's not like one organization that now is trying to have an agenda in all of these other cities, but like grassroots activists all over the place in Chicago, New York, Dallas, whatever, are like, hey, we can do this too. So a lot have reached out to Decriminalize Nature, like the original people in Oakland, to say, how can we do this? What does your bill look like?
What's your model?
What's your model, and how can we write a model that is custom tailored to city X? And so that's the momentum right now. And there's one, for instance, in Washington, D.C., the city of D.C., Oregon has its initiatives. I do think Decrim Nature has been really successful. I think the DC initiative, especially now that they're able to sort of collect signatures through an online route, which will help because of COVID.
That's better than standing on the street, for sure.
For sure. Well, yeah, I mean, so California also had, this whole state of California had a campaign, Decriminalize California, and that was specific for psilocybin, but because of COVID, they weren't able to collect enough signatures in time to qualify for the ballot. Oh, so wow. Now they're trying to petition to the state for an extension, but point being is the legislators in DC actually helped the activists before it was too late by enacting an emergency legislation so that they could do this digitally and continue to run.
There have to be a lot of jokes within psychedelics going legal in Washington, DC.
You know what? DC is a very progressive city. You know, it's funny how it's funny that, you know, who's living there and
who really needs this psychedelics.
It's just, the contrast between the federal law in DC and the really progressive municipal politics is funny.
Interesting. Oh, I'm learning a lot. I'm glad that was a good question. Okay, so when you look ahead, what are you most excited about in the psychedelic space?
What am I most excited about? I am excited to see all of this grassroots organizing. I think that it's extremely encouraging. I think, you know, in talking about this as a singular movement, I think both, quote unquote, both sides of the movement need each other. And what I mean by that is, you know, the presence of grassroots activists all over the country or world really, make it so that the FDA approval approach seems a little bit more conservative and buttoned up. And I think we need that contrast because when we, you know, as psychedelics, like specifically psilocybin and MDMA, make their way through the FDA approval process to becoming prescription medications and assisted psychotherapy, that is a very specific process, and the patient intake will be very specific, and the way that they're able to experience the medicine will all be under certain protocols. And I think
will you be able to opt in? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, yeah, you'll have to have a qualifying diagnosis, and you know, it depends on what your diagnosis is and whether you're trying to go for MDMA or psilocybin. But you know, it's exciting to me, but it's also exciting that there are people who are working for greater access. You know, questions of insurance coverage are a big issue. Who's going to be able to have access to the medicine? Whether enough therapists of color are going to be trained in order to kind of tackle like race-based trauma. So I'm excited that the conversation is starting to diversify. With DoubleBlind, we have courses out on growing your own mushrooms. We just actually closed that course, but we're coming out with another one shortly. So just follow along at DoubleBlind Mag on social media, and you know, check our website every day for new content. And again, our third issue is coming out just in a little over a month. So order it, and I'm excited to share it with the world.
How would you describe your ethos? Where are you coming from?
We say that we're using psychedelics as a jumping off point to talk about mental health, spirituality, social equity, queer culture, environmental justice, all of the above. So we do have news, and especially we're going to be publishing more frequently, so that'll help us stay on the news wagon. But you know, our readers are interested in sex and mushrooms and all of these sort of niche topics that haven't really been covered for a mainstream audience, and you know, are maybe a little too elementary in some scenarios for kind of like a deep state psychedelic publication. So we're sort of trying to capture an audience who isn't already necessarily in the psychedelic world, but is definitely curious about that world and maybe has tried it or hasn't, or you know, is open to it. So
that's good. That leads me to my last question, which is, what do you wish more people knew about psychedelics, about the movement?
I think that psychedelics are really sacred, and I think that doesn't mean they can't be fun, and that doesn't mean they have to be overly clinical. I think the cannabis conversation has forced us into thinking about, you know, these medicines through this dichotomy of medical marijuana versus like recreational adult use. And I don't think that's necessarily accurate. I think you can have a medicinal therapeutic experience, you know, whether you're dropping acid at a concert or in a forest. You know, medicine can be fun. And at the same time, it's nothing to take lightly. And I really want people to heed set and setting, what you're going into before you take it, and also just to be prepared to have a mystical experience or to have a scary experience, and to embrace all of that, knowing that it's really just a way to get more in touch with your soul. And I'm excited that therapists are starting to use words like soul, which is really fun for me. So yeah.
That is a shift. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.